Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining this evening. Hope everyone's doing well. My name is Matt Young, and I have been working on Amber Books since 2019, and I'm excited to talk about building code today. The question that we sent out, posted on social media, etc., for the day is a local developer is planning a new mixed-use building on an infill lot. In order to maximize area, the developer wants to pursue a scheme that has a retail and office level starting 9 feet below the sidewalk. Each unit adjoining the sidewalk will have a dedicated staircase, and all units will be accessible through a shared elevator lobby and hallway. So the question of the day is, does this scheme meet accessibility code? I'll give everyone a little moment to chew on that. And then, so does this scheme with these 3 retail units and an office meet accessibility code? And then I'll follow it up with another question, which is, why doesn't it meet code? So hopefully you thought that it didn't meet code. And the next question, which I'll give everyone a few pauses to think about, is why doesn't this situation meet code? Okay, the answer is that it doesn't meet code because these 3 public entrances are not accessible, since these staircases bring able-bodied folks down 9 feet below into the space. And part of accessibility code, according to the IBC, the 2018 version, which is what is used on the ARE, is that all public entrances have to be accessible. So before we talk about that further, I wanted to jump into a story about a lawsuit that happened in New York City. So in New York City, there is a program called the Professional Certification Program, which allows licensed professionals, specifically professional engineers and registered architects, to certify that their plans meet all laws. Why does this exist? Why is this important? It allows builders to start their projects before receiving Department of Building permit approval. So in a place like New York, where time is money, you can see why a client or an architect would want to have that certification. And so in this case, the case of this lawsuit, the Department of Buildings is basically trying to suspend an architect's professional certification privileges for a year because they did a few things wrong. 6 of their submitted applications showed negligence, incompetence, and a lack of knowledge of the laws. 2 of their permits submitted through this program were revoked in 1 year, and they failed 2 audits within 6 months. So getting into some of basically what are some specifics about this lawsuit. So this is one of the revoked permits. The building had been permitted for storage, distribution, and maintenance of stapling, packaging, and fastening machines. And it kind of, accompanied by a loading dock and offices and sales rooms. So you can think that this is a office supplies warehouse that ships staplers. The architect filed an Alt 2, which kind of stands for Alteration 2 application just for interior renovation work. It was a pretty extensive list of interior renovation work, and the application contained more than a dozen architectural drawings describing that renovation work. You might be confused by this Alt2 designation, and that's because New York City has a specific program where an Alt2 is pretty easy, and an Alt1 is most severe. So from most stringent to least stringent. That's the numbering in New York City. Oop, trying to draw an arrow. So in the case of the ARE, alteration level 1 is actually our least stringent, and alteration level 3 is our most stringent. And as you might know from your studying or from your work experience, an alteration level 3 is where work is exceeding 50% of the building area, and an alteration level 1 is basically just removing, replacing existing materials, finishes, and equipment. No major changes. So just wanted to clarify that so that we're kind of staying on track with what we're trying to have in mind when we're testing in the ARE. Okay, so back to the lawsuit. What was wrong in this particular case where the permit got revoked? So the submitted plans showed a change in use and occupancy, which, as New York City mandates, would require an Alt1 application on an Alt2, and obviously an Alt1 application would have a much more significant review by the Department of Building and would necessitate a new certificate of occupancy. Due to the change of use and occupancy, the entire building is required to be accessible for folks with physical disabilities, and the existing building was not, and the plans for renovations did not change that either. And also, due to the change of use and occupancy, columns in the cellar and first floor did not have proper fire protection. So how did they get caught? This was fun for me. I hope everyone enjoys my little bubble, guys. So the story went like this. The Department of Building requested more information about the project because they thought things were a little fishy. In following up that request, the architect included a letter from the owner of the premises of the building that indicated the building was going to be used as a trade school, very different than a warehouse, right? So the Department of Building is like, From there, they questioned the architect further. The architect admitted that the existing certificate of occupancy did not include classrooms, computer rooms, training rooms, meeting halls, conference rooms, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And the architect's argument, which I think is really bold, is that the building was not being used as that change in occupancy. He stated that he had mislabeled the rooms, undergoing renovation based on their future use, but that just because there was a future intended use didn't mean that that's how it was being used at the time. And when asked if the rooms reflected on the plans were consistent with creating a union hall and training school, the architect responded, possibly, to which the building department said, "Are you kidding me? Your permit is gone. And also your certificate as well." So why does this matter? there's a significant difference in occupant load between a machinery or office supply warehouse and a trade school. And these images are kind of just speaking to differences in density, right? If we have a school and there's an emergency, it's really hard to get out. A warehouse, you've got fewer people, maybe larger amounts of space, not as difficult. So quite literally, depending on what the specific occupancy was of the warehouse and what the specific occupancy would be of the trade school, in the best case scenario for this kind of shady application, there would be 6 times more people in the building than it was rated to sort of safely support. In the worst case scenario, there's 25 times more people. And so when you think about a scenario where someone happens to forget to file for the change of occupancy, the situation's never reviewed, the space is containing 200 students, a fire breaks out, and those 200 students have to exit the building in an environment that was designed for just 8. So on top of that, because this now needs to be an accessible space, the owner of the building, the architect, folks involved could, folks running the school, they could come under a lawsuit from the Department of Justice. That's who administers over the Americans with Disabilities Act. And I fact checked this today, and the Department of Justice published that penalties can be as high as $92,000 for a first violation of accessibility code. So of the Americans Disabilities Act. So I would say $92,000 is much more than an additional application and the cost to change a certificate of occupancy. So high risk, low reward, I guess. But anyways, I kind of also wanted to throw out to everyone tuning in, do you think that this is an appropriate penalty, kind of taking this risk and of losing this certification to sort of expedite projects for a year? And do you think the public would think this is an appropriate penalty? So I'm going to give everyone a chance to think about that. All right, so another question to you. If you were responsible for licensing architects, what are the 3 concepts about building codes that you would require candidates to understand? And maybe if folks want to start in the chat, I might populate some of these bubbles. Let's see here. Life safety, zoning. Zoning. What else? Egress. Occupancy and construction type, fire protection. These are all great. These are all great. There's accessibility. And I'm just going to abbreviate fire protection. Okay, awesome. Thanks, everybody. So the way that I think about the first category is of building code is a category of preventing emergencies. So that's fire protection, how we classify occupancies, and how we separate this different occupancies based on the potential risk that they pose. The next category is creating safe situations for when there is an emergency. You can't always prevent every emergency, accidents happen, et cetera, et cetera. And what this specifically is egress, how we exit a building safely. And the third section of the code that I want to group together with the first two is prohibiting discrimination against people with disabilities and keeping them safe when there's an emergency. And so these are three main categories of what you're going to be tested on the ARE in regards to building code. And this is the three categories of things that we're talking about today. I think it's worth mentioning that the fourth thing, which we're not really going to go over today, is sizing. So that's building height, area, and also occupant load in how it relates to sizing. And if you want to study more on that, that's going to be the 2018 version of the International Building Code, Chapter 5. So, okay, so this exercise of what do you think, if you were a licensing board, what do you think the most important areas of building code there are for licensure candidates to demonstrate competence in? That exercise is kind of about putting on your NCARB hat or your NCARB lenses, which is something I often talk to licensure candidates about as a way of trying to understand what the question is asking of you in the test taking environment. So I think that if you can anticipate what this licensing board wants to certify in terms of your knowledge, I think it helps you look at a question that you might have otherwise found challenging and discern what a correct answer could be. So from NCARB, if you haven't ever had any thoughts about what part of building code do I need to memorize, they say it themselves. They do not recommend memorizing ADA or IBC. They do recommend understanding the general format and understanding how to navigate both IBC and ADA, because those might be things that you see in case studies. So more specifically in these three categories, preventing emergencies, that's going to be chapters 3, 5, 6, and 7 of the IBC. And if you've been taking our course, you've probably heard us talk about having a similar perspective with reviewing AIA contracts. You don't need to memorize the contracts, but you need to be familiar with them. And it's valuable to sit down and just kind of read your way through. And that same advice maps to these different segments of the building code. They're not particularly long, really, if you think about it. And I would really recommend just taking some time to look through the different relationships that these chapters are establishing, and use that to help you formulate some rules of thumb about the building code. So the second, safe situations when there is an emergency, egress, those would be in chapters 9 and 10. I put in parentheses that chapter 9 is basically determining if you need sprinklers or not, and what happens if you do have sprinklers. And then when we talk about accessibility, that's in two places. That's in the IBC, chapter 11, quite literally called accessibility. And then there's also ADA standards for accessible design, which right now NCARB references the document published in 2010. So going back to our original question, does this scheme meet accessibility code? The answer being no. And we then went a little further. Why doesn't it meet code? Because we have these 3 public entrances that are not accessible. And I think that this scenario is meant to reflect, this is also an example of something that was rejected by the New York City Department of Building for this exact reason, that these 3 public, even though they provide an elevator lobby, and in theory, someone in a wheelchair could come around and access the building this way. The public entrances, which are on the sidewalk here, see? Sidewalk, and have stairs going down into the space. It's 9 feet below the sidewalk. The Department of Building said, no, that's unacceptable. Even though it was an existing condition, they were changing the occupancy, and because these were all public entrances here on the sidewalk, it was unacceptable. And you know, I think what's really important here is that this is an example from New York City. Their approach to the building code is what you might describe the big city way, where there's maybe a lot more attention given to things like this. And the NCARB way is going to be really similar. The exam isn't going to be asking you for exceptions to the rule. They're much less likely to be asking you with a scenario like this, how could you pull off accessibility given this current, you know, they're not going to have you going and deep diving into the building code to locate an exception to get around a sort of mainframe piece of accessibility code. They're really instead going to be asking you questions that are probably erring on the side of being conservative and are life safety focused. The other thing, if you find yourself in the test taking environment and you're hunting through a reference or trying to find an exception to the rule, this exam is written for people to be able to answer mostly in multiple choice. There's a time limit, so the questions are written not to have you spend 15 minutes hunting for an answer, but maybe at the most 4. And the exam is also designed to be computer graded. So keep that in mind if you're really jumping down the rabbit hole of looking for an exception in the references. So here we are. Here's the exact section from the code. Section, come on now. And section 1105, which is chapter 11. In addition to accessible entrances required, at least 60% of all public entrances shall be accessible. And so in this case, since each entrance for each unit is kind of split 50-50, we only have, sorry, this one doesn't really count. We only have 50% accessibility. So the other thing too to think about is that this is also not a good scenario in terms of egress. You can imagine if someone was in a wheelchair, for example, and they were shopping in the front of the store and an emergency happened, they couldn't exit out the alley through the fire stair. They couldn't, in theory, exit up this 9-foot stair. They'd have to travel all this way to egress out, and that is a life safety concern. So that is our question for the day. And thanks everyone for tuning in. This is a lot of fun for me, and enjoy your evening and go get licensed.